All right, folks, as our first panel takes their seats, I just wanted to reintroduce, a first ever for us, on the heels of our flagship conference, the Spectrum Security and Resilience Summit. And one of the goals that we're trying to accomplish with this, we just hit upon. That's bringing the wealth of experience and expertise in folks who join us here at the University of Colorado to talk about spectrum issues and connect them with folks at the state and local level. I didn't mention this, but I'm a former state legislator, and I really think that state and local officials could benefit from tapping into some of this expertise, talking together, and sharing your on-the-ground experience with us as policy is being considered and developed. And so without further ado, we'll launch into our afternoon agenda. And I'd like to introduce Peter Tenhula, the moderator and a current senior fellow at Silicon Flatirons, for his panel, Lessons from the Airwaves. Without further ado, Peter and panel.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Anna, for kicking us off. Appreciate that. And she addressed a couple of the issues we're going to revisit and talk to you a little more in depth. Again, this panel is to kick off and kind of ground us historically. And to do that, I've tapped some of my good friends who in our old jobs had some interesting experiences that we're going to talk about and kind of the lessons learned from those experiences. I'll kick off a couple kind of mine own experiences, and then go down the line with Todd, Julie, and Jeremy, and then we've got our token academic down at the end, Henning, who's going to kind of sum it all up and kind of express his ideas of what are their core problems here, that we're experiencing, and how we can address those. And then the next two panels will kind of talk about what it's like now and what the current situation is on the ground, and the future potential solutions to those. So let me just give you from my perspective, and Anna covered a couple of these issues, but when I was I retired from NTIA, and you can go online and check out our more detailed bios, and I'm not going to ask everybody to kind of talk about their long, historical, dreadful historic bios like mine, because it goes back way far. But my last job before I retired, I was at National Telecommunications and Information Administration within the Department of Commerce in the Office of Spectrum Management. And I was the chair of the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee. In that role, I was in charge of this big book called the NTI Red Book, or the manual of basically all the rules that govern federal agency use of spectrum. For a long time, that manual included authorization for the Department of Defense or military department to engage in electronic warfare for testing, training, and exercises. Made sense. And that was governed by a whole set of internal kind of guidance that DOD did in coordination with like other agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration and the FCC. And that worked out really well. The next problem that came up was domestically improvised explosive devices, IEDs. Those are, we heard about those overseas, in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there's actually a threat from those kind of devices. So the Department of Justice sought authority to do training and exercises for those, and so NTI amended the manual to provide that authority, subject to guidance, the Department of Justice. An issue there was state and local governments, because Anna mentioned Section 333 of the Communications Act, which does prohibit, jamming, and it does, it has been interpreted only apply it, to non-federal users. So federal users like Department of Defense, for training purposes, and Department of Justice, FBI for purposes of, countering these IEDs, they could definitely use and deploy and test jamming. Those jammers were typically, they had to cover multiple bands, the cell phone bands, paging bands back when there were pagers, and any kind of like land mobile bands that could potentially trigger IEDs. Those were very, very expensive devices, so they were unlikely to get in the hands of the bad guys. So we start developing these lines between the good guys and the bad guys. Then the next problem that came up to me was involving the UAS, the drones, the nefarious drones that were at first encroaching military bases. They were flying over military bases. So the Department of Defense needed authorization to interdict these nefarious drones. And so we figured out a kind of a solution to help them do that. Then came the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice. They all lined up, and before I knew it, we're sitting in these windowless rooms with all these other agencies, trying to come up with legislative solutions, authorize these agencies to counter these drones, because there were privacy concerns involved in that, because of detection, but also because of the jamming. We wanted to make sure that it was as restricted, as limited as possible, so that the bad guys didn't get a hold of the technology. But you had situations like like preparing for the Olympics, World Cup, the NFL. Those were kind of the threats that we were dealing with at the time. But it goes back further. There's have been bad actors in the past, and it brings back memories of, remember, Captain Midnight intruded the signal of HBO, and that led to a new federal statute being enacted. And it also led to some technology developments in the satellite space. There all kinds of other threats, and I'm going to turn it over to Todd in a second to talk about his experience with the contraband devices in prisons, and the efforts they did. But there's all kinds of security surveillance equipment, off-the-shelf jammers that are starting to be used by the bad guys. Anna mentioned those, including when there was an incident in outside of Denver, where burglars were using the jammers to jam Wi-Fi and security cameras in order to facilitate their crimes. And she mentioned all the states that have enacted laws to make that illegal. And she mentioned the FCC's NPRM on combating contraband wireless devices, which has a unique approach to interpreting the law in Section 333. And so I think it would be an excellent research topic for students. Take a look at that NPRM and that theory. So before I turn it over to the other panelists here, talk about the examples, I just want to remind, we will have questions at the end. We'll open it up. We do have a mechanism for online questions because we have a large online audience, and we'll be taking those as well. So those of you watching online on Zoom, there's a way to submit those questions. So now I'll turn it over to Todd, who's got some excellent stories about how he, when he was at the Bureau of Prisons, protecting the situation there from contraband devices and drones. And I'll turn it over. Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. We're all friends of Peter here, and it's a pleasure to be here. I don't play one on TV, but I was a federal prison warden and chief of security assistant director, and with $10 I can get one of these great Colorado coffees. But it's a pleasure to be here. And Peter is just, as evidenced by his award last night, he is just the cream of the crop. And I'm proud to know you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a great conference. Matt and your staff, just tremendous. And Commissioner Gomez, don't hold it against me. I'm going to say some things you're not going to like, but I hope we can still have a conversation afterwards. So, yeah, Peter and I, long time, going back to the 2010 Contraband Cell Phone Act. Vice Chief of Security Technology for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the late Senator Feinstein, her staff, we authored that act to make it an actual felony or misdemeanor at the time. It's been upgraded to felony since to introduce, possess a contraband cell phone by inmates or staff in a federal prison. But that, you can go back, contraband cell phones in prison is a 20-year problem. There's nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon said. And there have been different iterations of that to try to attack the problem. And this conference has been very good on all everything from ARPAN to AI. It's just been very, very illuminating because the newer problems, and the panel yesterday talking about WorldCom, well, it's the same in the contraband illegal devices and counter UAS. It's all the same. They run over the airwaves. And how do we, as Peter said, sort the good guys from the bad guys, not impact the rights of the public, and do it in the right way and protect America's prisons or the venues like a Super Bowl or a World Cup setting. So contraband cell phones, I've got to tell a testing story. The records replete with contraband cell phones being used to drop, or drones really, but contraband cell phones being used to foment criminal activity inside and outside the walls for the last 20 years in federal, state, and local prisons. There are 3,500 federal, state, military, and tribal and territorial jails and prisons across this country. Every one of them has a contraband cell phone problem. Every one of them has a drone problem or will have a drone problem. Trust and believe. So what do we do about that? They're used to coordinate hits on the street. My good friend Brian Sterling, now the U.S. Attorney for South Carolina, when he was director, one of his captains was brutally shot at home 7 times because he was the expert in chasing contraband cell phones inside that prison system. So it's an existential threat because it is the bedrock of the illegal inmate economy. It is a bedrock of coordinating whether it's witness intimidation on the street or inside introduction of dangerous contraband such as synthetic drugs, fentanyl analogs, other contraband cell phones and SIM cards, and increasingly weapons and escape paraphernalia. So we started out in the 2010 Contraband Cell Phone Act and have worked in concert with FCC and NTIA because Bureau of Prisons is one of the 5 law enforcement components in DOJ authorized to use it. And Peter was always, and I think Commissioner Gomez alluded to this, when technology is nascent, when it's growing, the technology outstrips the law. So we don't have the law, let alone the procedure, regulation, and protocols to deal with it. And I'll get to that a little bit with counter UAS. But with the phones, we did some barrage jamming testing in 2010 because Congress told us to, and the NTIA was our partner in that. In 2018, we did a single microjammer test at the FCI Cumberland, Maryland, because the administration at the time wanted us to. In 2019, they funded, and then we did really the first large microjamming test to eliminate contraband cell phones at the maximum security Broad River prison in Columbia, South Carolina. Brian Sterling was deputized under my authority, and we exercised that test, and we invited our friends from NTIA because I said,
Not me.
Not him. Peter was too scared. But, no, he wasn't. But he's the man that made stuff happen. So Frank was one of the cat's names, these 2 bright young engineers from right down the street here in this Boulder. And they came in Department or NTIA, which headquartered with this. Anyway, they came down to South Carolina. They brought all their testing equipment. I put them in the inmate housing unit where we had installed the microjamming devices and the plumbing chases between the cells. So the officers, this is a state institution, but I'm a federal official conducting the test under NTIA auspices with a deputized staff there. So when you want to make it happen, it can happen, but it was a heavy lift. So these 2 engineers, great guys to this day, and they did a great report. They wheeled their testing equipment out into the middle of the common area of the inmate prison unit, and they're running their tests and everything, and we turn on the microjammers, and there's no interference. You'll be happy to know, Commissioner, we limited the interference to 1 foot outside the unit. You could not make a call out 1 foot outside the unit, but after that, there was none, and that's all documented in that wonderful NTIA report. So they're doing their testing, but the officers had forgot to close the food slots. If you've ever been in prison or jail, you got to have the food slots. You feed them their food, their mail, whatever. And so the inmates, you talk about the power of contraband cell phones and the underground economy of a prison. Inmates actually threw a shiv, as we call it, a shank, a sharpened weapon, at these NTIA engineers. So at that point, I decided it was prudent to move them up to the front of the unit, put them behind protection as they continued their on-site measurements. So that was a real-world testing of enacting spectrum policy in a hardened environment. So we go on, a lot of association. Poor Peter. I would always call him on the special temporary authority. After his bureaucrats said no, I said, come on, Peter, we got to get this done. And he would always find a way to do it consistent with NTIA and, of course, with our friends at the FCC. So the next big issue, as Peter said, was counter UAS. And this started back on the Obama administration, 2014, 2015. Federal prisons had a few drone incursions, a few drops. But if you can read all the reports from the Inspector General and everything else, it went to hundreds a year. And what are these drones dropping? Cell phones and SIM cards, synthetic drugs, fentanyl analogs, opioids, weapons of escape, weapons, tobacco, all the dangerous contraband that put both the staff and the inmates' lives at risk. So this is a big deal. So we started, how are we going to interdict this? And Peter's exactly right. I remember the summer of 2015 or 2018. Nothing is easy. If it was easy, everybody would have done it, right? That's why we're in this room trying to tackle these hard issues. But we had 15 classified and unclassified briefings that summer, all across Capitol Hill and other places. And we were able to get the 2018 Emerging Threats Act passed, which gave the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice, including the Bureau of Prisons, the legal authorities to detect and mitigate drones that presented a threat to covered assets, as it's euphemistically called in the law, federal prisons, or the FBI in an escort mission. And then there were several specialized missions carved out for DHS. But that was a heavy, heavy lift to get the legal authorities so that NTIA could bless the mitigation deployment by the Bureau of Prisons, DOJ, and everybody else. But just because you got a law, so what? Now you got to make it work. So we drafted the Attorney General's guidance. I was on that work group. I ran the Department of Justice counter drone testing, and I brought all the best technologies at the time, from those in the sandbox, those domestically, and we tested, again, getting assistance from my man Peter so we could test mitigation. But Peter would not let me block GPS. And I've held that against you to this day, my friend.
I blame the FAA,
Yeah.
not me.
But we had a great, great test, and that was, to my knowledge, the last great test that involved DOJ, DOD, NTIA, all the alphabet soup agencies in the fall of 2020. So here's my drone story for you. Why is it a threat to federal prisons? Imagine it's 1 a.m. at an unnamed high security federal penitentiary somewhere in the bayous of Louisiana. You have 15 or 16 staff watching 2,000 high security violent inmates. They're all locked down. They're sleeping for the night, except for a few orderlies. A Matrice 600 flies in, undetected, because at that time, I'm very proud of the program we stood up at the Bureau of Prisons. Again, not speaking for the Department of Justice in any manner, shape, form, or representation, or my current company, Smart Communications. This is just Todd, the old prison warden. So they came in at 1 a.m, and criminals have 24/7 to defeat the countermeasures we put in place, the bad actors, as we're calling them in this setting. They actually, in the institutions, they have laundry bags, right? Got to collect the inmates' clothes, and they get taken to laundry, and that's how they do it, just like any other institutional setting. So they actually got laundry bags that mirrored the prison's laundry bags, stuffed them full of contraband, brought them in on this commercial Matrice 600, and at 1 a.m, we had video of them lowering the bag down outside the unit. It landed with the pile of laundry bags already pushed out of the unit to go to the laundry at 5 a.m., and there was their contraband drop. And we got it on camera. Unfortunately, we're not able to interdict that one. But in the wake of that, before I left, I'm proud of the guys that are still there. We stood a very active counter drone program. The Bureau of Prisons right now has detection at 60 of the 121 sites, mitigation at several sites. So it's been an effort. So I hope those were stories enough. And I'm the only one that's ever deployed with my friend Peter. and microjamming in a prison setting in the continental U.S. and the whole political backstory. And I'm going to shut up here because these guys are much smarter than me. That's what I liked about this conference. I'm learning a lot. The whole ethos of this microjamming rule, it's come back around on cell phones for state and locals. There's been a political effort the last 15 years from governors and state attorneys general to give state and locals the same authority that we were able to exercise on the federal level. So that is out for comment. It will be an interesting time. So I'll be around after the panel and any questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. On the state and local issue has been interesting, and Todd mentioned the need to deputize the folks down in South Carolina, and that's through the Marshal Service, and there's a law that authorizes that, and that's how we got around that interpretation of Section 333. Is basically, okay, if it doesn't apply to federal, we'll make the state folks federal. And this is, I think, going back to Dodge City, where, the whole deputizing, federal marshals. But it also limits the amount of people, and they did it in the counter IED context too. But it does have this effect of limiting the personnel that are authorized to do these kinds of things. So we didn't mean to make it hard for the good guys, but it's also, we understand it's starting to get easier for the bad guys. And Julie and Jeremy are going to talk about some of maybe the bad guys that they talked about, or maybe the not so bad guys. But Julie was head of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. They dealt with both the intentional side and the unintentional side of interference. And what kind of interesting stories do you have, and what kind of lessons learned from those experiences, Julie?
Thanks, Peter. So as Peter mentioned, I worked at the FCC in the engineering office for more than 45 years. The last 14 years of it was as the chief engineer. And I retired, it was January 3rd, 2000, 6 years ago. And some people have asked me, what have you been doing, since then? 6 years of therapy. And you listen to the problems here, and I don't take them lightly at all. Working through my career was very rewarding, but you're also faced with these kinds of challenging issues. And as I looked at the topic in security and resilience and all, and I looked at it in the context of access to the spectrum, assurance that you can actually use the space you think you're supposed to be able to use. And I came up with, over 45 years, only 4 lessons. So first lesson, for folks, is the starting point for controlling the interference really is to develop a good set of rules. It might surprise you that the FCC's rulemaking proceedings often have what I would gently call folks with different perspectives on what the standard should be and what the risk of interference is and so forth. But the resulting rules usually take into account more than just the engineering. You often hear folks say, well, it should just be the engineering and you can't defy the laws of physics, et cetera, et cetera. Surely physics is a part of it. It's not the only piece. It's creating opportunities for new services, weighing the economic issues, the policy issues, and so forth. And the people at the FCC are faced with trying to balance all of these things to come up with what they feel is a reasonable approach. The technical rules are generally designed to minimize the likelihood of interference. They're not based on zero interference. And when the analyses are done, you get into things like, okay, there's probability in the propagation loss between 2 services. What number do we pick? What's the right element in that? What do we assume about the levels that the service is using for reliable service, et cetera, et cetera? What are the characteristics of the receivers? All of those things kind of go into the analysis with the aim that there are so few cases of actual interference they can be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Now, not everybody is always happy with the result of the rules. More often than not, I would say that people find they can live with it, and life goes on. And if problems occur, and we heard about the one over here on the public safety, I'm glad I'm not there right now, but I know what I'd be doing. I'd look at, the first thing I'd be looking at is everybody playing by the rules. Is something overpowered? Is something not in a location that it shouldn't be? And when the interference occurs, all of these services, they're obliged to correct it. So I think the first step in here, I would be very careful not to, with a broad brush, paint the rules as, oh, this is going to be a disaster. I'd want to look at each one of these cases on a case-by-case basis and really understand it. And you're entitled to protection. That shouldn't be happening. So something needs to be examined here and to figure out what the problem was. So I'm going to move on. And the other thing to remember is, like, once the rules are done, if a problem occurs, you can always come back to it later. Sometimes it's a simple remedy that you work out with the industry. And it's key for all the players, I think, working on these things together, because the rulemakings take time. If you really find a problem that the best solution is that you got to go and fix something in the rules, that's been done before. But people need to have certainty if they're going to invest in building things for a set of rules, that they can go forward and make those investments and actually deploy. So first lesson is get a good set of rules. Second lesson, sometimes stuff just happens outside of the rulemaking. I think for me, some of the more difficult problems were the ones that were not anything that people anticipated or that came out of a rulemaking. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, 3 actually. And many of you may have heard these before. Some of you may say, oh, that was long ago. Those sort of things can't happen again. Well, they do. So the first one we're talking about is police radar detectors. Most of us now, you're using social media to identify and crowdsourcing, identify, okay, the police have got a radar here and so forth, and look at that. At the time, the radar detectors were very popular. And for the most part, they really hadn't caused a problem. They were effectively receivers. Receivers, they don't emit anything, right? Well, it turns out they do. And so the receivers actually had something called a local oscillator. It emitted on a particular frequency. And all these detectors in most places where I just read the sign and say, radar detectors are illegal. Well, the police were very clever. They looked for the signature of the radar detector oscillators, and the industry responded. They moved the local oscillators outside of the radar band, thinking, well, they won't hear us now. Well, they moved them smack into a satellite band. And the satellite dishes were located, in many cases, along the highways. And when the traffic was coming through, there was interference to the satellite systems. So what do? So you look at the rules, and the receivers all the way up to 960 megahertz, well below the radar band, had not been a problem. And these things were operating near 10 gigahertz, with the only requirement be that they not cause harmful interference. So it really required, in the end, a revision of the rules to bring them under emissions limits to solve the problem. So that's one example. Second example, digital television. A lot of work went into developing the standards and the rules for digital television. And I think it was around 96 or so. First commercial DTV station goes on the air. Hooray, great milestone. They turn it on, and all of a sudden, the biomedical telemetry systems at the nearby hospital, this was in Dallas at Baylor University, the telemetry system stopped working. These are people being monitored for critical health issues in the hospital. Turns out that they're operating under the unlicensed rules on channels that had been vacant all along, never bothered anybody. And technically, they were required to accept interference. But it's not a good look for a television station to turn on and have people die. So what the heck do you do? So we got everybody together, worked with the Food and Drug Administration, worked with the vendors, and in the end, we had to do a rulemaking to identify spectrum where the medical devices would actually be protected. They had an allocation. They weren't operating these critical systems under unlicensed provisions. And so we went through the rulemaking, created new frequencies for them. We worked the television stations when they went on the air. They worked with the FDA and with the hospitals to make sure that everybody had enough time to change the different frequencies, and it all worked out. But it was difficult. Third thing I'm going to mention, and I'm not just jumping on unlicensed because there's other cases too, but after 9/11, the military decided to deploy mobile systems at its military bases for security purposes. This spectrum had largely been unused. And so they go about investing, working with the vendors, they turn on the system, and suddenly the nearby garage door openers are not working right. It wasn't that the doors were opening. It was either the range was decreased, and I joked often that people would say, "Gee, I could do it at 200 feet. Now it's 50 feet," and I'd say, "Don't you slow down when you go in the garage?" But it was more than that. In some cases, they didn't work at all, and for many families, when their kids came home from school, they used the garage door opener to let the kids in. So again, and I think this is probably, when you run into these problems, a good way to go ahead, bring everybody together. The arguments about who's right and wrong don't necessarily help you solve the problem. So the garage door openers, they weren't protected, but the problem was, even for these folks, what could they do? It turns out there were other frequencies the garage doors openers could use, but they weren't in the stores. So even if somebody had to buy a new system, they weren't there. So what we ended up doing is coordinating between the military and just trying to be good neighbors to the folks nearby. This was not, if you understand propagation and the different characteristics of the systems, this wasn't like all of a sudden 30 miles outside every garage. Some of them went out, others nearby were just fine. It all depended on the orientations of the systems, but we got through it. We did not allocate new frequencies there. And, at the time, the notion of using wireless via Wi-Fi into the home was not even in the scope of ideas. And now you've got systems out there who basically take the garage door opener and you can open your garage door from 20 miles away if you wanted to. So 3 examples, and there are other cases, and the lesson out of this is you can't really anticipate everything. Mm-hmm. And when it happens, you really need to be diligent in jumping on it. Get the parties together, figure out how you solve it. It may be different in each case. So the next thing I'm going to go to is dealing with what you, this is the last one. I skipped wrap up. Yep. I went to situations where folks are causing harmful interference by they're operating outside the rules, but they never intended to cause harmful interference. So one of the more difficult situations was at 5 gigahertz. So, there were multiple blocks there. There's a block in the middle that used a technique that was another step in the progress towards dynamic sharing. It was called dynamic frequency selection. Was really complicated. The problem that you often run into when you're dealing with sharing with systems that the military uses as radars is they can't tell you what they look like, and they're not going to tell you when they're on. And the difficulty, if you put yourself in their shoes for a minute, they're not only worried about you, they're worried about systems, the technology winding up more easily in the hands of adversaries to be used against them. So this is, when you go into these things, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're working with and the important things that they do. So what happened? So there was a block of spectrum as part of this package that did not require dynamic frequency selection because there were no radars there. So what did folks do in some places? They retuned the units that they had to the part of the spectrum that was supposed to have DFS, and they turned on there because it was quieter. And lo and behold, that part of the band was used for wind shear radars at the airports. And this was not a case of somebody, operating at the very weakest signal that they could use. You could look at the radars at the airports and it showed up as spokes. And a handful of spokes were bad, but you could still see the pattern of what was going on. In some places, if you had enough of these things happening, it was not good. And so our enforcement people were terrific. They went out. These things were not easy to find. And then you'd go and say, look, you're operating outside the rules. It really took probably a while before the agency went after the folks that, at the source. It turned out that certain models of equipment were well known as easily modified. And they could sit there and say, well, it's not us. We just put them out there. It's somebody else is doing this stuff, and they're selling them like hotcakes. And it really required enforcement action, big fines, because what happens with these things, if they start small and they grow too fast, it's much harder much more difficult to deal with them then. And the last thing I'm going to hit on, so the lesson out of all of that, yeah, there's another one. I'll only mention quickly. Sirius XM, FM radios.
Can we segue to Jeremy on the enforcement stuff?
No,
Okay.
I've got the. Yeah, I'm almost
Okay.
wrapped up. So, this was a case where Sirius XM was trying to sell kits for people to get their radio into the cars, but then they wanted to get it into the audio system. And so how you do that? You transmit into FM. Well, to make it work better, you just increase the power of the FM a little bit, and suddenly people in the next car over were listening to Howard Stern instead of the religious broadcast they thought they were tuned to. So we went through a whole thing. We did tests at our lab and all, and basically we came up with rules to redo that. So the last thing was just when you've got folks who are deliberately causing interference. I won't say much about that because you've heard about that from enough cases here. Sometimes it's done with a worthy purpose. I won't get into the debate about the legislation and what the requirements and so forth, but you heard from Todd about, the problems he faces. I had, sat in a room with folks who came in and said, my daughter was killed because of distracted driving, and I don't want this to happen to anybody else. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put a little jammer, just say it's okay to put a little jammer in the car so that they can't talk on the cell phone. And, those are really tough issues. One last thing I'll mention, Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi. So, Wi-Fi is being used or unlicensed being used in some places to provide broadband service. Believe it or not, there's competition between the providers. So one, and each of them technically is not protected against interference. So one aimed his signal right at the receiving antenna of another. So now you've got two unlicensed devices, neither of which is protected against interference. And what do you do then? So yes, I'll turn it over to Jeremy. Thanks for listening.
Jeremy, from his last job before retiring was in Enforcement Bureau as the deputy chief there, and I'm sure lessons learned from some cases there as well.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Peter and Dale and Matt and Silicon Flatirons for having me. It's a wonderful conference. I I retired from the FCC last year. Not actually retired. I work at a small firm called Lerman Center, and the obligatory disclaimer: what I'm going to talk about are my own views, not those of my firm or my client. But as Peter said, my last stop at the FCC was as Deputy Chief of the Enforcement Bureau. Amongst other things, I oversaw the FCC's field offices. The FCC has 13 field offices scattered across the country. There's also an equipment development group, as the FCC either will purchase commercial off-the-shelf equipment, purchase commercial equipment, modify it, or at times build their own equipment. We have a dedicated fleet of mobile direction finding vehicles, and we modify the FCC, not we anymore, but the FCC field offices modify the equipment to be very specialized for direction finding, for finding and locating sources of harmful interference. That basically is the core of the FCC's field office's mission, is to find and attempt to stop harmful interference. There are other sort of adjacent issues that are handled by other headquarters-based offices, in particular the Spectrum Enforcement Division, which I also oversaw, and that would get into things like potentially working with CBP to try and keep the jammers out of the country, as opposed to finding ones once they're actually in and being used. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to try and speed things up a little bit so there's time for questions. But Julie and Commissioner Gomez did a great job kind of laying the groundwork. So I think I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what either of them said. I do want to give a little bit of a high-level overview, just a little bit, particularly for the students in the room who may not understand how enforcement and particularly field offices fit in to the entire scheme at the FCC. Enforcement is what we would look at as ex post. There's a problem, and we have to go out and solve it and make it stop. And also, if necessary, find somebody or take other actions if it's really worth any kind of punishment. But the enforcement regime is only as good, as Julie said, as the rules. And thankfully, Julie's old office, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the various rulemaking bureaus do a tremendous job of coming up with the ex ante rules that basically, when they work right, and they mostly do, limit the universe of problems so that when you do have an individualized problem, you can go to the Enforcement Bureau, and then whether it's field agents or a headquarters type issue, look at it and get it resolved. And I think it's very important to realize the overwhelming majority of things work. That's why your phones work. It's why your routers work, because the rules actually enabled the manufacturers and the service providers to build the equipment to provide the service, and 99% of the time it's going to work. Even when it doesn't work, there are a variety of reasons for why it doesn't. A lot of times there'll be a complaint, someone says, there'll be whether it's a fire station, police officer, individual persons calling in saying, my device isn't working, I must be getting jammed. And the agents are very well trained on the intake. There's actually electronic intake these days. You're going into the portal and you're answering certain questions. And the agents do a really good job on the front end of understanding, okay, this looks like it might be really serious and we got to get on it right away, or not so much. And there are plenty of instances, and I can't give you specific numbers, but I mean, there's well more than 1,000 complaints that are going to come into the fields in any given year. A lot of them are going to be, it turns out, somebody's equipment just isn't working. Maybe that means it's not working for them in their own office. Maybe it means their equipment is causing a legitimate problem to somebody else. You have a Wi-Fi system and your access point, it breaks somehow. You have what's known as a spurious emission in a license band, and it's causing interference to a T-Mobile or Verizon or whomever. The agent's going to go out, they're going to use their specialized equipment, they're going to identify the problem, and they're going to knock on the door. Agents actually all have badges. And they're going to tell somebody, they're going to use their equipment to make sure it's actually coming from the equipment. They're going to ask to come in. They don't have arrest powers. They don't carry weapons. And they're going to ask people to turn the equipment off. And most people are going to be cooperative. The stories you hear about, a lot of what's being talked about today, are kind of the situations that don't work well and don't work normally. but I want to give everyone kind of a big picture that in a lot of ways, the field agents are kind of unsung heroes of the agency, and that they do their job every day. They solve the problem. It goes away. It's not, whatever was happening was probably not intentional, and they go on to the next case. And that is the lion's share of what is going on. Then you have the much more difficult cases, either where the rules allow a certain amount of interference and parties are at loggerheads that way, where you have bad actors, or where you have people who just don't know any better but don't necessarily react well when the government comes knocking on the door. There's a host of cases like that. Whether it's somebody had a jammer in their vehicle because their employer wanted to track them. They didn't want to be tracked. They put in the jammer. They happened to park their vehicle at Newark Airport. That caused a little bit of a problem. And there's numerous cases like this where, yeah, somebody probably was doing something they knew they shouldn't be doing. They didn't fully understand the radio frequency impacts of what they were doing. We had a warehouse in, it was either Dallas or Houston. I think it was Dallas. The owner of the warehouse didn't want her employees using their phone on the warehouse floor. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's a bad idea, but she had a signal jammer as the way to do it. Agent showed up. She actually threw it in the trash and then told the agent he can go find it, which he declined. But you have instances like that where it's not great, but it's not really bad. Then you do have instances where no, somebody is setting up a high-powered jammer, and they know exactly what they're doing, and it's a question of finding it before they move it somewhere else, and you have more malicious events. As Commissioner Gomez said, another thing the field agents do, and they do it working through the Public Safety and Homeland Security, who's the lead on the national security events, but they work in coordination with the whole of government efforts to respond to when there's big outages after hurricanes or to national security events like the upcoming World Cup, the Olympics. There's a ton of resources that go into it, a ton of agencies working together on those sort of things. And the field agents will have one part. Public Safety Bureau has its part and is largely coordinating for the agency in addition to the chair's office. And they'll do things like when you have a large gathering like that, you have a lot of agencies coming on the scene. They all have their own devices and operate in their own spectrum. That requires a certain amount of deconfliction. You also may have a certain amount of, well, what's the RF environment kind of looking like when things are calm, so that if you need to find something bad going on, you can. And there will be agents actually get stationed at the right places to, if there is an event like that they're able to respond quickly. Because we, as we've said, there's 13 field offices right now across the country, so there's a limited scope. But when there's particular priorities, the agency is prepared to respond and does things proactively too. Otherwise, the agency tends to be very complaint driven. There's no like a secret panel of this is the spectrum for every spectrum band everywhere being proactively monitored. The FCC is very complaint driven and in a lot of ways consistent with the whole licensing schemes for wireless. There's a certain amount of trust built into it. Let me see if I can skip ahead, but I do want to just give a shout out and thank Commissioner Gomez as well to the field agents who are doing this work day in and day out, because it's not always the most high profile work, but it's important work to get done. Other key points, and Julie alluded to some of this, is some of what you have is intentional. Some of what you have is not intentional. Even on the intentional, is it really malicious or not? A lot of also, particularly on the jammer issues, it's not just that somebody has a jammer and they're using it, is how are they getting the jammer? That's not so much a field agent as either a headquarters based or working with other agencies to, what do you do to try and keep jammers out of the country? And there's a lot of quiet work that goes on behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that DHS will do at the ports. I'm not personally familiar with all of it, but agencies talk. And in particular on the jammer front, you you also talk to platforms. I mean, there was stuff wasn't specific to jammers, but to covered equipment that is manufactured by certain Chinese entities that's not legal in this country anymore. And the chair's office worked out arrangements with some of the big online platforms, so they won't sell it anymore. There are similar type conversations so that if you were to look to buy a jammer on Amazon today, most likely you're not going to find it. You might stuff slips through the cracks, but there are other websites that are not US based, and it's much harder. So there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot more to be done. And then there are, of course, the new interference scenarios as new bands come online. How does the FCC make sure it's able to detect interference in those bands? And it's always coordinate. And one of the things that I did when I came to the Enforcement Bureau in 2014 was really try and step up the coordination between enforcement and the other bureaus, so enforcement would know what's coming, so that we could know, okay, there are new interference scenarios coming, and we need to prepare our tools for it. There's always a little bit of a chicken and egg issue of well, if there's no equipment there yet, obviously there's no direction finding equipment for it either, but you do work on it. I think at that point, given the time left, I'm going to turn.
All right. Before I turn to Henning, kind of his observations, and I go back further in history to when first radio laws were enacted. Another license approach was radio operator licenses, and those radio operators, they couldn't do stupid stuff. And if you did stupid stuff like, causing intentional interference or distress calls, whatever, you get your radio license, your radio operator license yanked. Another approach was call letters, which we still hear on the radio at the hour and a half hour, right? This is WAOU, whatever city. And that's an ex-ante approach that you can identify which station is causing the problem. And that the whole station identification approach. And we've, I think in the context of, UASs, the FAA has already required them to identify themselves, as well, to identify rogue drones. So I'll turn over to Henning and see what his ideas are from all this and observations. See if there's a path forward, and then we'll open it up for audience questions.
All right, thank you. All right, so I wanted to kind of, as academics are prone to do, to generalize a little bit.
Yeah.
And I see we've talked a lot about all these cases of enforcement. That I think there are four basic issues that if we want to ensure a safe radio operating environment for legitimate users, we need to be able to do four things. We need to be able to scale enforcement. It is not sufficient to simply say, yep, we can indeed send out a field agent. We only have, I don't know, 50 or something like that. I don't know what the numbers is exactly. It's a large country. I mean, even if they could get there by the time, as you said, and others have said, by the time the agent can physically get there and get the truck there to radio locate, interference may already be elsewhere moved on. So it has to scale to the number of devices. And obviously, we don't have to say that here, that the number of devices has just been in an order of magnitude larger than when we started out radio call letters, when you had a few thousand stations in the country that are stationary, people had radio receivers. But how many people had legitimate radio transmitters at home until cordless phones, really? I think that's, and CB radios were probably the first examples and probably indicators of trouble to come. I believe the CB radio environment was a hint, from what I recall, way before my time, of some of the difficulties, given that truckers had incentive to boost their power and all of that. So scale is the first one. And scale is often one of where, when you rely on human scale, as in adding more agent, Congress and appropriations come into play, and they don't tend to scale very well. So we need to think about scale as one, can we scale by adding automation? And I'll get to that. The second one is, beyond scale and geography and number, is scale and time. How critical is it to resolve the issue within hours, within days, or That's something probably somebody should look into, but it's not critical. It's like reducing the performance of something, but it is not mission critical. It is, for example, for a cellular system, an LED sign on Times Square is reducing the performance in a particular band, but cell phones operate on multiple bands, so maybe your Ookla speed test is not what it would have been a week ago or before the sign was. This third one, and I think that often gets ignored, is enforcement needs to discourage both the careless and the malicious. Namely that, and we know, I'm not a criminal justice lawyer, but the little I know is that often certainty of enforcement is more important than severity. Threatening a death penalty for something might sound good, but it is much more, if there is a high likelihood that I can get away with the crime, even if the penalty is millions of dollars of fines, let's say, in a radio environment, well, maybe I'll just make the calculation that unlikely that I get caught, and so I'll just take the risk. This is the same thing that we see in traffic enforcement. It's one thing to put up a speed limit. It is pretty clear, and there was a recent story in New York City that traffic cameras allowed only in New York City in school zones caught orders of magnitude more speeders than NYPD cops could, simply because every cop, every speed enforcement is risky. You have to chase people. It takes half an hour of cop time, probably 2. And so by nature, you're not going to get many people. So by design, putting up more speed cameras, and this is not the place to argue about their merit here and being perverse incentives it has, is more likely to yield compliant behavior by people not speeding than just saying, oh yeah, there's some cops around. And we saw that during COVID when suddenly people started noticing, hey, the cops aren't enforcing the speeding laws, so maybe I can kind of push the informal 7 miles over the speed limit to 17 miles over the speed limit. The fourth characteristic is efficiency. And this is kind of a drone problem in the sense, like if you think of Ukraine or others, if it takes $1 million, a rocket, a missile, to shoot down a $10,000 drone, your war economics don't work out. As in, you're not going to get bankrupted on the military equipment, but you're going to get bankrupted economically. You just can't afford to spend $1 million on cheap equipment. In that. And that's probably one of the fundamental insights now that we have, not just for drones, but also that jammer equipment can be ordered via Temu and other sources very cheaply and at scale. That just wasn't possible. So if you have to spend days of agent time, of enforcement bureau, field agent time to chase after a Temu device, the economics just don't work out long term. So I believe that we need to take into account when we design radio systems to enable scale, reduce time to discovery and remediation, to provide a discouragement so that people know that if they do something they shouldn't, whether that is Wi-Fi providers being a little more aggressive or using devices that were meant for indoor use outdoors, or putting an amplifier on a Wi-Fi antenna on that, whatever it may be, that they're likely not going to last very long. And the efficiency in terms of economic efficiency has to work out. So I believe one of the mechanisms, which indeed, as was pointed out, dates back to the very earliest days. I looked it up. The earliest call letters were assigned in 1912. So it goes back that far because it was recognized that both shipboard radio, which was one of the earliest motivations for federal radio regulations in the US and elsewhere after the Titanic, and commercial radio stations in the AM band at the time could only function particularly because of the diverse propagation characteristics, as in you wouldn't really be able to know what that station was that had suddenly 1,000-mile propagation because of some atmospheric conditions that were poorly understood as to what station that might be that you could hear that you normally couldn't hear. So I believe there is a necessity to think at the time of designing both devices and spectrum bands to make it possible to identify malicious or inadvertent non-compliance rapidly. So one of the proposals that I'm discussing that was mentioned earlier is to build an identification capability, kind of automatic station identification into radio systems so that regardless of the technology, whether it's 5G or Wi-Fi, that you send periodic beacons out that say, this is the registered device, and registration, whether it's an operator or a manufacturer, and it allows you to much more rapidly and importantly, and this is where scale comes in a distributed manner to identify devices so that legitimate operators can not only, they don't have to just say, oh yeah, there's some random Wi-Fi device that's out there that's interfering with me. I have no idea where they are and who they are. They can actually say, yep, I got the station code that my device could pick up that is doing things that they shouldn't be because it's an indoor device and I shouldn't be hearing that device because it's not one of my devices in that. And so that then allows, to the extent that's even necessary, field agents to intervene, or they can do enforcement by email or enforcement by letter, simply because they can identify the authorized purchaser of that device and say, hey, you're operating a device outside of bounds of operation, cease doing so, and you don't have to send a person there to go sniff for that particular device. And with that, I think we can
Great.
move on.
We have a few minutes before the break, and I'll get ready to open up for questions, especially so get a student ready and the roving mics. Who's the student that's going to ask the first question? Then we'll see if there's any online. And I think my quick takeaways is that sometimes laws need to be changed. Sometimes regulations need to be changed. But always laws and regulations need to be enforced. And maybe that's a simple answer to all these problems that we've continuously faced all this long history. So if anybody wants to delve back into any of this history and ask a question about it, please let us know. Who's first? There's Max back there.
Thanks. I have a student question kind of about the maybe scaling and like complying, thinking about what was mentioned with working with e-commerce platforms to remove jammers. Is there also work that FCC and NTA might do working with like operating system vendors or device makers to do more automatic detection and mitigation of, bad behavior, whether it's negligent or not?
Anybody?
And I think there are always opportunities to look to see whether there's technology that can help to whether it's to more easily identify whether it's jammers or other illegal equipment that's being sold online, or to Henning's point, to try and make it easier to detect. And I think those are probably open discussions that might be happening within the agencies. They're not going to want to tip their hands as to exactly what they're doing. And can you repeat the second part?
Okay. The second part is basically just kind of extending that of like, what are maybe disclosed things device makers can do that make it low friction for users, but do make that enforcement easier. For instance, like if Apple were to do something in iOS, given how many devices, they control.
And I can say something. So I've worked on, independent of malicious interference, on the device on interference identification. So it's if you want to look up a paper, it's called Do You See What I See? And the idea was that, and currently, and of course, the previous panel, all the cellular and fiber providers rely heavily on Wi-Fi. And from what I've heard informally, leaving aside interference, one of their most common customer complaints is, I bought a gigabit or multi-100 megabit network and I'm getting 50 megabits. Refund my money. Why am I paying for that? And it turns out that they put their Wi-Fi access point on their microwave oven, which is a bad idea. or other interference devices, they put it behind some metal cabinet or whatever in that, and you can't send out a Comcast agent to figure out why this isn't working, at least not at reasonable cost. So I've been somewhat surprised that even kind of modern advanced Wi-Fi systems, particularly access points, are really, really bad at helping users identify where the cause of lack of performance, whether that's interference, Wi-Fi and other devices, baby monitors, garage door openers, can be all kinds of things. Neighbors in urban areas are often the cause in that. I mean, where isn't much you can do besides one, maybe find a more advanced device or talk to a neighbor about getting a mesh system. And that the ability of consumers and operators and carriers to identify those is really surprisingly limited. And so I don't think this is as much an NTIA issue or an FCC issue, is that the Wi-Fi industry, and I think Wi-Fi 8 is supposed to focus on resilience as opposed to just bumping speeds. There's a real opportunity to help users identify why they can't get the speed that they purchased.
I think you also need to look a little bit about a cost-benefit analysis there when that kind of issue tends to come up in FCC rulemakings. And I was in rulemaking bureaus before I did enforcement. You get a lot of, well, it's going to cost me, the manufacturer, X amount of dollars to put whether it's the software or the hardware in the device. And is that accurate or not? But how resistant is a manufacturer or service provider to doing it? What kind of demand is there on the customer side? Or even like, is a Samsung or an Apple or somebody hearing that their customers want this and are going to try and put it in? So I think in a lot of ways, you need a dialogue on it and to start a discussion to sort of see where the pressure points might be. And if everyone's more or less aligned, it becomes a much easier ask, whether it's voluntary or through a regulation. Where there's real counterpoints, it becomes much harder unless you get regulation.
Any online questions? No? No? We got one more. I think we got one more time.
Interesting panel, but it illustrates a hazard when we talk about the lessons from history, which is something I study occasionally. Most of the history of radio is analog, but today's radios are digital. And so, I mean, you have stuff like jammers and analog interference. I mean, it's all cool war stories. But, the real practical things for today, the practical problems are the things that Henning mentioned about scaling and identification. And sort of, we solve those problems, I think, by exploiting the unique characteristics that digital brings to radios. Question mark.
Too late. So who's going to take that?
Does anybody have a question? I mean, I think that technology is going to change, right? Bad guys are going to try to improve their technology. The manufacturers that sell to the bad guys are going to try to make their technology cheaper and easier. We didn't get into the kind of physical layer, spectrum side of things, like spoofing and the things like the Stingray, which is kind of IMSI catchers, fake cell sites, fake hotspots, right? That, is that really RF interference, or is that, that's maybe on the networking layer, on another layer of are nefarious, bad acting problems as well, and who is responsible for that? Every time there's a technological advance, whether it's hackers or things, digital from analog, somebody's going to, we're going to be, obviously the regulators are going to be behind, in dealing with that. We see it in, the stories coming out of Ukraine, with regard to the drones. Drones are becoming autonomous. They're not even relying on GPS anymore. So, how's Todd's successor at Bureau of Prisons going to deal with that? When they're dropping, the contraband,
Because I'm going to sell them some good stuff to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Right. You're gonna. So there's as Dale likes to remind us, there's incentives all around, right? So it's like, how do you get it? How do you get in front of the incentives? How do you get in front of for lack of a better word, innovation? You know, that's constantly taking place on all sides. And I guess it requires diligence, and that's what our next panel is probably going to have to come up with the answers to, right? And with that, we have a break for.
Thank you,
Thank
Peter
you.
and panel for a great conversation today.